all of these lovely people, and now we're going to move onwards. At this time, it's my honor to introduce Garrett Jin, who's going to take us into our keynote session. Garrett is the Senior Vice President of Enterprise Business and Community Engagement, right, for Greater LA Bank of America. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have a moment just to tell you how much we appreciate B of A's support today and in so many ways. Thank you so much, Garrett.
All right, good morning. Kudos to Amanda for knowing the longest title in the bank, Enterprise Business and Community Engagement. And we're delighted that the community engagement part is what we're about here today. It's great to bring everyone together. We're delighted to be presenting sponsors of the conference again because it's so important to bring together this audience to be more connected, more empowered. You know, in our company, a lot of people do a lot to bring about thriving communities, whether it's investing, lending, but also the philanthropy is so important. And so we're really delighted that all of you can be here today. You know, we've been involved with SCG for many years, and we're represented on SCG's Corporate Leadership Council by my colleague, Raul Bustillos. He's taught me to roll the R over all these years. But thank you, Raul, for all your involvement. And you know, this is an important setting. You know, if you tune into any cable news, you know that this is the most consequential election in our generation, everyone has said, right? But you know, if you ask an elected official like Secretary of State Padilla, every election is consequential because there's so many decisions about healthcare and education and all these things that we care about and what you do as philanthropists, as program officers, as people in your corporate foundations. So with that, we're really delighted to have the Secretary of State here because certainly an important part of an engaged, connected community is having an educated, engaged electorate. And we want to really learn from the Secretary of State about his views on how he is outreaching to California's growing and diverse population to get them to be more aware about the importance of voting. He's spent his entire public sector career really advocating for the issues that we all care about, whether it's childhood obesity or quality home ownership and affordable housing. So we're delighted to have the Secretary of State here. And it's great to have him as a keynote speaker, but then also a very unique opportunity to have a dialogue. And he'll be joined by Efrain Escobedo from the California Community Foundation to really lead us in an interesting dialogue on all these matters about voter engagement in our civil society. So with that, please join me in welcoming Secretary of State Alex Padilla.
Good morning, everybody. Morning, everybody. Got that second cup of coffee working? I want to thank Garrett for the kind introduction and for the return on my CDs periodically. Just follow their advice when it comes to managing your money. You'll be thankful later. And to Chris Essel, of course, who's been a dear friend for many, many years, for the invitation to be here for you, with all of you today. I don't know if this is me doing you a favor. I feel like it's you doing me a favor to allow me to bring my message to this powerhouse group of philanthropy here in Southern California because as I learned in Coro, Mr. Ken Chalkins, a long, long time ago, we all got to work together. So let me actually kind of start there with my message this morning. How many people do not know about Coro in this crowd? Raise your hands, raise your hands. All right, so most of you know something about Coro. As someone who went through Coro, I'll tell you why I went through Coro. And this kind of gets to the question that I will anticipate later. How do you go from engineering to politics? When I left engineering, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, a couple of friends pointed me in the direction of Coro. And as I learned about Coro and the series of experiences I could expect if accepted, from spending time in the private sector, in the public sector, in the nonprofit world, in a media organization, with the labor union, on a political campaign, et cetera, my big takeaway from Coro was, if you want to change the world, we all got to work together. Nobody does it on their own, right? And I say that proudly as a representative of government. Government alone can't change the world, right? And talk to your friends in the private sector respectfully. They know they can't change the world just with private sector investment and force. You talk to anybody, and we quickly realize if we want to change the world for the better, we got to work together. And I think that's both at the crux of what you do in the philanthropic circles, but why we're having this conversation here today. How there is a direct linkage between philanthropy and you pick the public policy you're trying to effectuate, but a partnership with the public sector and others, of course. So I'm going to share over the course of the next several minutes a couple of things before we get to this dialogue with Ephraim that I hope I studied enough for, because he always has great questions. First, a little bit of what we're doing in the office, and I'm going to end with the why I do what I do. Because I've been secretary now for a little bit more than a year, about 14 months. And when I was sworn into the office, let's just say it left even more to desire than I expected when I came into the office. The state of affairs in the office, while they had done the bare minimum over the last 8 years, just think of the election side alone, right? There was no scandals, no Florida 2000s, no butterfly ballots, no hanging chads. They did the bare minimum. But the reason I ran for office and the reason why the future of California elections got together, and we'll talk about that in our conversation pieces, because the Secretary of State's office could and should do so much more, not just in terms of registration and turnout, but to truly engage the citizens of California in their communities and in our democracy. And so, I looked at the various divisions of the Secretary of State's office from business filings, for example. So for those of you who are in the startup entrepreneurship, emerging markets world, it was taking, once upon a time, 42, 43 days for someone's business registration to be processed. Think about that. Entrepreneurs willing to invest in California and create jobs, their experience was, thank you very much, we'll get back to you in a month or two. That's not right. Thanks to the legislature and an infusion of resources, it's manual right now still, but we're turning these applications around in about 5 business days, sometimes 4, right? So significant improvement. We're working on the sustainability side of it, hoping to automate all these transactions sooner rather than later. Another aspect of the office that some people know about if you're really in the business, and that's campaign finance. This is an election year, Garrett, and part of the conversation is there's so much money in politics. At least for state candidates and state campaigns, we're required to fully disclose every single penny, where the money comes from, how the money's spent. Where do you go to find this information? Pop quiz? Secretary of State's office. And the web page specifically known as Cal Access. Good news, Cal Access was the first of its kind in the nation. Bad news, it hadn't been maintained in 15 years. Think about what your cell phone looked like 15 years ago. Well, when it comes to accessing public finance information, that's kind of the technology that we're working with, folks. I'll save the good news update for the conversation side, but working in collaboration with the philanthropy world, we've made significant improvements to how Cal Access and specifically PowerSearch looks and what the experience is with that for folks looking for that information. Another area of my office that I hope is going to be increasing interest to all of you. The first law passed by the first legislature in modern California charged the Secretary of State with preserving and making publicly available all the official records and documents of our state government. I am the custodian of the state's archives. Think about what's in our collection. It's not quite as exciting as Nicolas Cage in National Treasure, but it's close. Think of, communications from recent governors and their administrations. Think of copies of every bill that's been passed and signed into law by governors. Think of the original California Constitution, which, by the way, is in both English and Spanish. Learn something here today. In English, we were a diverse state to begin with, right? Tell that to everybody running for president right now. But clearly the most visible part of my office, when people think Secretary of State, they think elections. And what are we doing to, number one, make sure elections are conducted on the up and up? But I mean, think about that. If you look at the Constitution and state statute, my only job is to make sure elections are conducted appropriately. Nowhere in there does it say, Mr. Secretary, what are you going to do to get more people registered? Nowhere in there does it say, you got to maximize turnout. It just says, make sure elections are conducted appropriately. And clearly, I think the public expectation, as it should be, is much higher than that. So what are we doing to get more people involved and engaged? You know, I think some of you have also been funders of NALEO in the past, National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. I'm terming off the board, and I served for 3 years as its president. And you can blame NALEO for my definition of civic engagement also stretching far beyond just voter registration and turnout. If we look at civic engagement, it really is, are people participating in the political process, either however you define it or in all elements that fall into that? You know, from citizenship to voter registration, to turnout, to things like redistricting, where we got some great news out of the Supreme Court this morning, to census participation, to on and on and on. For me, it's real simple. Are people involved in their communities or not? So just a couple of key points of what we're working on, and then the why, and then the conversation. On the citizenship front, there's no formal part of my office, I wish I had the resources, to promote naturalization for the more than 7 million people in California who are eligible and haven't taken that leap. I'd love to be able to tackle that in coming years, but for now, I have at least invited myself, and they haven't told me no, so I keep coming, to naturalization ceremonies conducted by the USCIS, from San Diego to Marin to Sacramento, Oakland, Fresno, just last Thursday in Keene, California, at the Cesar Chavez National Monument, talking to new citizens, not just to congratulate them on that process. I know, you know, very up close and personal when my parents went through it, how much of a journey that is. But taking the first opportunity to invite newly eligible people to register to vote and to vote, right? Why is that important? 2 reasons. Talk about the turnout piece in a minute, but on the voter registration side alone, there are another more than 7 million Californians eligible to vote, but can't because they haven't registered. They're over 18, they're citizens, but for some reason they haven't gone through the process to register to vote. You know, they haven't gotten the benefit of what I had when I turned 18, my high school government teacher not letting me out of his classroom until I filled out the form. And some people say, well, it's not that difficult. You go to the library, you go to the post office. It's even easier now. You can go online. So if anybody here hasn't registered, or you know somebody who hasn't registered, registertovote.ca.gov. It's really pretty simple. But 7 million people haven't done it. So we were inspired last year by the state of Oregon, that when they were the first state in the nation to kind of flip motor voter as we know it on its head. Everybody here knows that you have an opportunity to register if you want to when you're at the DMV. You're supposed to be asked the question. But Oregon asked a more fundamental question. If DMV is collecting the same information when you're applying for or renewing a driver's license or a state ID, name, address, date of birth, and a signature, the same information necessary to register to vote, why do we make people go through the process again? For people who are otherwise eligible, why can't we just register them to vote in the process? The first argument I hear is, well, you have a right to not be a voter. There's this thing called freedom of speech in America, and there is. And so we've created an opt-out registration process. If you really insist on not being involved in democracy, you fill out the form. Otherwise, the default is if you're eligible, you're added to the voter rolls. And so Oregon signed it into law. I sponsored a similar bill here in the California legislature, got to the governor's desk last fall, and he signed it, and now we're in the throes of implementation so that come next come next July, we will systematically register people to vote when they're going through the DMV. Now, we won't capture all of the 7 million eligible but unregistered, but our best estimate is that we can capture up to 90% of them over time. So think about that. I'm going to do this nice plaque for Jerry Brown when he's on the way out, as being responsible for the largest sustained voter registration drive in our nation's history, because it wouldn't have happened without his signature. But as some of the opponents also argued when we were pushing this bill through the legislature, not just isn't it easy already, why do we need this, but just because you register them doesn't mean they're going to vote, right? So there's a lot of reasons why people who are eligible, whether they've registered or not, aren't turning out. Some of them are very, very tangible. There's a lot of research in this space of people don't know it's election day or people don't know where to go vote. I know nobody here has that problem, but surprise, surprise, not everybody watches CNN and not everybody gets the campaign mail around election time. And so we have a lot of work to do to, I think, modernize the voter experience. And so this year we're sponsoring legislation that will change how we conduct elections, and maybe I'll leave the details of this to the conversation because I'm getting my 2-minute warning over here. But I want to end this part of the presentation with, why we do what we do. Is it just because I may be measured on how many additional voters are registered at the end of my first term compared to when I first came in? Maybe, but that's very, very secondary. Is it going to be how was turnout in 2016 and 2018 compared to the 42% turnout when I was elected secretary that ranked California 43rd in the nation? Maybe, but that's very, very secondary. I will end this session with this. I've thrown out a couple of stats, right? The 42% turnout in November 2014 means 58% of already registered voters did not turn out and vote. Separate and apart from the 7 million people who are eligible but not registered. Who are they? Who are they? Where are they? And here's why I do what I do. Because if I showed you a map of Los Angeles County, or Southern California, or the entire state for that matter, but think with let's just stick with the geography we all know very, very well. And I ask you to put red dots in all the areas where type 2 diabetes is way too high. What does that map look like? Let's take another map. More red dots. Let's put red dots in all the areas of higher rates of poverty and unemployment and low wages, et cetera, et cetera. All right, set that map aside for a second. Let's take another map. Underperforming schools. Want to go with that? Let's take another map. Bad air. You get where I'm going here? Now let's take out one last map and put out the red dots in communities of low voter registration rates and low turnout rates. Surprise, surprise, it's the same map. So you as an individual, regardless of what specific policy challenge you care about the most, you in philanthropy, regardless of your area of focus in your investments, they all lead back to participation rates. And I would argue to you that pick the social ill. We can't tackle it without getting more people involved. We can't tackle it without getting more people engaged, both because of what that means for the community itself, but also for the policymakers. I am one of those politicians. It doesn't have to be a bad word. But where there's communities that vote at higher rates and those that vote at lower rates, we know who gets a little bit more attention, and that's just a fact. So if we can work together on getting more people engaged and participating, I guarantee you we will make a big dent in health, in education, in economic opportunity, and in any other challenge we want to take on. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Secretary Padilla, great to see you. Thank you for, as always, those very inspirational words. And I think today we want to really focus on this idea of public and philanthropic partnerships. And to a great extent, I think you outlined the importance of that. As full disclosure, in my former life, having both started at NALEO, which helps shape my definition of civic engagement, but then also having spent time at the county registrar's office here in Los Angeles County working on a number of these issues, I have to say that there's transformation going on in the office, and that there's a shift from very transactional policies about maintaining what was there and protecting the way that we had been doing things to really transforming the way that the office does business and what the vision is for the state when it comes to expanding our democracy. And if we stick with that theme and with the energy that you've really brought to that office, I'd like for us to start with you sharing a little bit about your initial comment, which is you can't do it alone. You have to do it together with others, and especially when you're trying to transform things and bring organizations along that sometimes aren't ready to be moved along. They like the way that they're doing things. I'd like for you to share a little bit about, in the most recent policy changes that you've been able to implement, where have you seen, one, collaboration do its job and really allow you to really expand and push things forward, but then also two, where maybe were there missed opportunities where you could have had more participation from philanthropy to increase or go a little bit further that you may not have seen? And I know there's a number of examples that you could probably cite with some of the recent policy changes.
Right. So as I think back the first year and a couple of months that I've been secretary, I think there's a couple of entities that really rise to the top of have been great partners, and to the extent that I've been successful so far in the office, it would not have been possible, first, without FOS, the Future of California Elections, which I think there's some people here that are partners or members of that, and I'll explain why in a second. And the other, they're not based in Southern California, but the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. And I'll start there because this, I already told you where the idea for an automatic registration bill came from. We didn't come up with all the great ideas, but we've heard of a good one, and we want to run with it here in California. And both from the getting the language right, the drafting of the policy itself, Brennan Center and their legal expertise was hugely, hugely helpful, but also from the advocacy side, working with Brennan Center and their partners with everything from making sure the appropriate, respectful, but firm pressure was on the governor for a signature as opposed to a veto. And a big part of that was really penetrating a lot of the respected news media. I'll try to get in front of the LA Times as often as I can, but it's up to them whether or not to take my meeting, right, or my editorial board requests. And same with the SAC-B and the Chronicle. But when we had editorials in favor of our efforts coming out in the New York Times and the Globe and the Washington Post, and really sort of highlighting that what we were trying to do for California wasn't just good for California, but was a great model for other states to consider as we're having this national conversation about the future of voting rights. When there's some states that are reducing early voting, some states purging voter rolls and making it harder to register and vote, we were trying to show a different way and a better way. There's, I think, a textbook example of a partnership with somebody in that nonprofit or philanthropic world that our success wouldn't be possible without. I mentioned the future of California elections because, again, I think I have an occasional good idea, but I'm not above taking somebody else's good idea and running with it. The future of California elections, which is this sort of coalition of advocates to elections administrators at the county level, activists and organizers and others. For years they were suggesting the state of California should do this, the state of California should do that. And as Secretary of State, I get to steal all those great recommendations and put my name on them and say, hey, why not? Let's go do this. Let's get it done. And so for both the substance of what FOS has put forth in each and every year's report, to just the network that they put together, to have all these conversations so that people aren't talking in silos and hashing out differences in the first policy committee of the legislature. You know, folks convenes the conversations and the working groups to hash that out beforehand so we can present a united front to the legislature and the governor and make it really hard for them to tell us no.
Great. So,
So the other part of your question was, so where have we kind of fallen short, or where, I can't help but think this is an election year, right? We're constantly playing catch up and running out of time. If we want to make a dent in the registration stuff, as I talked about earlier, that's great. We passed the automatic registration. The bad news is it won't be fully implemented until next June, July. So we have a critical election year this year where we're not benefiting from the automatic registration. So we still have that work to do this year. How do we get more people to turn out? I'll talk about our bill in a few minutes here, but we're not going to benefit from a modernized way of conducting elections this year when there's so much at stake. So anything and everything that we can collectively do to get more people registered and get more people turned out, I feel a responsibility to do. I get asked all the time, do I have a grant for this? Do I have a grant for that? How do we fund PSAs, or how do we put up billboards, or how do we, continue to get the word out? I wish I had that kind of resource, but I don't. And I know in the nonprofit world, it's, well, we can't be partisan about this stuff. It can't be, for this candidate or against that candidate, or for this party or against that party. That's fine. By the way, I run into a little bit of that when I try to reach out to schools too, by the way. Can you imagine somebody resisting either a legislator or a secretary of state from coming in to talk to high school students about getting involved in registering and voting? Because we're not supposed to have political activity on campus, right? Well, I got to remind a lot of superintendents and principals and teachers, we're not being partisan about it. I'm just here to share information about why it's important and how to register on paper or online. By the way, May 23rd is the deadline to register if you want to vote in the June primary election. So if maybe we can kind of step up both our ideas and maybe some resources to put that word out this year. It's great that there's already excitement, out there, but until we get that 100% turnout, we're not going to be done.
and you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I think it'd be great for us to spend some time on this. It connects with the work of FOS, and I think it also connects with this idea of what can the philanthropic sector do right now that could really have some transformative impact in trying to strengthen our democracy here in California, and that's your bill, SB 450. It's a, you mentioned Oregon, so I guess now we'll mention Colorado, which is borrowing a model from Colorado around the idea of vote centers and all vote by mail and how to make elections more accessible. Can you talk a little bit more about, one, how that bill could really transform things in California to really narrow that participation gap? And two, what's needed to really get over that hump? Because this is the second year of that bill, so it had its first run, and we really have this year to pass it. So what's needed? What can this sector do to help bring that change here in California?
So two pieces. One that could be very, very helpful through the legislative process, and then one, if we're successful in the legislative process, that will be critical in terms of implementation. So let me tell you what Senate Bill 450 does, and I'll explain it by way of comparison. We're all very good California voters here, right? And so you know full well what your options are for casting a ballot. You can either vote by mail, and increasingly people do. Last November of 2014, more than 60% of the votes statewide came in by mail. But that means 40% of the people still prefer to vote in person. So if you're one of those people, what are your options for voting? It means that designated location close to where you live between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. on election day, period. Right. What other states have done, and I think Colorado is the best model that I've seen, they've changed their elections to work this way. First of all, they just automatically mail every voter their ballot. You don't have to ask for one. You don't have to sign up to be a vote-by-mail voter. Everybody gets their ballot in hand. Surprise, surprise. More people fill it out and send it back. But the beauty of their system is there's options for how to get that ballot back. U.S. Postal Service, number one. But every county in Colorado sets up ballot drop boxes throughout the county. kind of like a mailbox, but clearly marked otherwise. This is for returning ballots. And so you can drop your ballot off at any box anywhere in the county that's convenient to you. They also set up these ballot drop-off stations, literally curbside drive-throughs with county employees taking your ballot, kind of like the post office on April 15th. When we're dropping off our taxes, we need that postmark. You don't even have to get out of your car, and you can drop off your ballot. But for the people, and I suspect my mom is going to be one of these that still insists on going in person, they have migrated polling places as we know them to what they call voter assistance centers, or vote centers for short. So what's the difference? Difference is simple and elegant, but powerful. You know, when I go vote in person here, because guess who takes my mom to the polls? The first thing you do is you got to make sure you're at the right table, because if you're in the wrong table and you're at a different precinct, you may have issues. And then when you get to the front, they start flipping through this big ledger, right? You got to find your name. Then they make you sign, and the box is like this big. Got to do something about that. In Colorado, the experience goes like this. You go, it doesn't matter what line you're in, because when you get to the table, you're greeted by a laptop or a tablet. Each vote center has electronic access to the list of voters. And by making it electronic access versus paper access, they have access to the list of voters for the entire county, not just to people who live in that area. Great for administrators, even better for voters, because what does that mean? That means you can go vote anywhere in the county. Imagine being able to vote closer to work, if that's more convenient, or close to my kid's school after I drop them off in the morning, or by the grocery store or the shopping mall. Now granted, there's slightly fewer vote centers than there are traditional polling places, but the benefit that more than offsets is, number one, you can go anywhere in the county. You have geographic flexibility. And number two, the savings that they've realized, they've invested in early voting. So these vote centers are open for a week to two, municipal elections or statewide elections. So now you have the flexibility of when, where, and how to cast a ballot. Colorado went from 12th nationally in turnout to 3rd. Where was California? 43rd. We got some learning to do. And so turnout is up. Their cost of administering elections is down. That's a secondary benefit, but a benefit nonetheless. And that's what I've suggested as be the new way of conducting elections here in California. That's what Senate Bill 450 would allow. And so if that sounds good to you, contact your legislator, support the bill, communicate to the governor. We'll need his signature. And it comes at a critical time anyway, because with or without modernizing how we conduct elections, we need new equipment. Let's think about where we've been as a nation in the last 16 years when it comes to voting. Well, what happened 16 years ago? 2000,
Florida.
State of Florida, butterfly ballots, hanging chads. That was the last time Congress said, oh my gosh, we can't let that happen again. You know, here's money states, go get new voting equipment. And in California, a lot of counties did, most counties did. Some counties got equipment that is still in use today, but that makes it, what, 10, 15 years old? What was your cell phone like 10, 15 years ago? Some counties got equipment that was decertified because it wasn't secure, it was hackable. And so they went back to the old system from then, which is now decades old. So we need new equipment. And as we're making a budget ask of the legislature and the governor for new voting systems, the question is, do we invest in a brand new first generation BlackBerry? Or do we invest in something that's more functional for the voter? So that's what we're trying to do.
Great. Now, I know we could probably definitely nerd out on some more election stuff here. And you know, the point about funding our democracy is always overlooked because we're funding issues. And it's not until a Florida happens that you realize, oh, in California, we actually haven't invested any money for over 14 years. And we know that there's been leaps and bounds in terms of modernization that's happened. But our devices here, particularly in LA County, are still essentially a pen and a paper. And that's how we preserve our democratic rights. But I want to open it up to our audience here for questions and give you all an opportunity to present some questions to the secretary. This is a great opportunity to have him here and learn more about his work. So any questions out there? Yes, I think there's a mic coming up to you, so if you can hold your question until you get the mic.
Would you talk a little bit about the voter suppression laws that are going in many states in our country?
Yes, no, I appreciate the question because not everybody follows it nearly as closely as we do, right? Let me give a couple of examples and how California is different, and we're trying to be even more different, set a better example. In the last several years, I mean, really since the Supreme Court gutted Section 4 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, we've seen dozens of states act in three general areas. There's other more creative things going on, but these are sort of the big three. They are either, in my opinion, overly aggressively purging voter rolls, right? If you haven't voted in X number of years, you're going to be dropped from the list, and then you got to go fight to get back on the list. In the case of former felons, right? In California, if you're 18 years or older and a citizen, you have the right to vote unless you're in state prison for a felony conviction or you're on parole for a felony conviction. But once your time is done, your voting rights are restored. You have other states where you never get those voting rights back again, or you literally have to petition the governor, and they're not fans of restoring voting rights. That's kind of one category. I talked about the early voting we're trying to bring to California. Many other states were required to implement early voting to make up for their previously historic practices of denying people the opportunity to vote. Well, since it's harder to challenge voting rights violations now, they're just slowly reducing. Oh, we're not going to have 2 weeks of early voting. We're only going to have 1 week, or we're only going to have 2 days. Oh, we're just not going to have early voting anymore because we don't want people to commit voter fraud. It's a false argument, but they're using that to try to reduce opportunities to participate. And another one is mandating a voter ID, right? And while some people may think, well, come on, really, what's wrong with that? We all have an ID at some point. I can't get on an airplane without having an ID. Is that too much to ask? Well, not everybody has one. Even in California, only 90% of the people have a driver's license or a state ID. But it gets so intentional and blatant. I'll give you 2 examples. In North Carolina, you know, when they say you need an ID to be able to vote, then you have to list out what ID is acceptable, right? If you have a gun permit in North Carolina, that's good enough to get into the polling place. If you're a student at a state university and bring your state university student ID, that's not on the list. I'm sure there's a policy reason there somewhere, but I can't find it. Alabama, where no sooner do they pass their voter ID law than they proceed to close the DMV offices in the states with the highest percentage of African American population. And they face this huge backlash. So what does the governor say? Oops, we're sorry. We'll reopen them, but they're only open like 4 hours a month. So that people who may not have an ID or have to renew their ID, then they can go those 4 hours in a month or have to go to a different county. So, you know, all these things are going on in other parts of the country, hard to believe, but it's true. And again, kind of why I ran for office. California prides itself in policy leadership, right? From raising the minimum wage now to, you know, climate change and renewable energy. We ought to apply that same policy, ambition, and leadership to civic engagement. That's what we're trying to do.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Very quick answer. What's the prognosis for SB 450? How tough of a road is it? It got rolled over from last year. Who were your opponents? How's that work?
Right. So what are the chances of Senate Bill 450? I'm optimistic, but I was in the legislature for 8 years, so I take nothing for granted. You know, anything can happen, even to the best ideas. And so we just want to make sure that the legislature is absolutely clear that people who think it's a good idea, that we communicate to them. I take as positive signals that the discussions are not, is this a good idea or not, but literally we're in the weeds on, well, how many vote centers? Is it one vote center for 10,000 voters, for 15,000 voters? Do we want early voting for 10 days or 2 weeks or extended hours? We're into that level of detailed discussion, so I take that as encouraging. But you know, I can't rest until there's a signature this fall. If time allows, I do want to talk about one other example of sort of a public-private partnership from last year. It wasn't on the election side, but I think it was absolutely one of the highlights of the first year. It was on the campaign finance side. You know, I talked in my prepared remarks about Cal Access and how it hadn't really been updated for 15 years. Well, Irvine folks, raise your hand. There's an organization in the Bay Area called MapLight that, through however they've raised money historically, they try to shed light on campaign contributions and does it or doesn't influence how policymakers cast their votes, things like that. Working with the Irvine Foundation, Irvine funded MapLight. They grew their team of coders, basically, their programmers, and developed a new search engine that's still utilizes the same CalAccess data that my office puts out, but instead of utilizing a clunky search engine that the Secretary of State's office years ago developed, you can now go to our website and click Power Search and see the search engine that MapLight developed with Irvine support that is much faster, much more intuitive, and is very, very reliable, unlike CalAccess. And we thought that was brilliant, not only for state candidates and campaigns, but now also for independent expenditure campaigns, because that's really where a lot more money is going each and every election cycle. So the bad news, that's only the front end, only the public-facing side. It's still kind of built on old technology. We're trying to get funding through the legislature to rebuild what we call the back end. But from a public interface standpoint, it's leaps and miles better than what has been the case for far too long. And I think it's a great example, not just of a public-private partnership to get things done for a government, in this case the state, working on very limited budget dollars, because Jerry Brown is still very, very responsible with our budget, thankfully. But also because I think one of the key challenges for governments in general, particularly the state, is information technology projects. Right? If you were to Google State of California IT projects, you get nothing but bad news. Right? There's another department that shall remain nameless that just went to the legislature this budget year to ask for $100 million, not for ongoing IT, but for ongoing litigation with their IT contractors. And so, we're not trying to brag too much, but we're trying to be a good partner by saying, look, working with the philanthropic world, for $100,000, we brought an IT project to fruition, not just to the RFP stage, to fruition for public benefit with little taxpayer expense. That's a way to do things. And so we're trying to build on that model for the other elements of CalAccess, because coming back to engagement, this is an election year. We hear about all this money in politics. Part of an engaged electorate is an informed electorate. And if you can't access the basic information of who's supporting who, it may be harder for you to make your decision. So as we're partnering with Irvine again on the next stage of it, trying to inform more people, because if we're trying to bring so many more people into the fold, the 58% that didn't vote last go around, or the 7 million people that we're now registering, it's not just about getting them on the rolls and sticking a ballot in their hand. It's, do they have the information they need to make good decisions? Part of that is, campaign finance. And so as we rebuild it, not just to be more reliable and more quick to get that information, we want to do it in multiple languages, heaven forbid. And both for campaign finance information and for Senate Bill 450's implementation, there's got to be a lot of public education going on with that, so that people who are now registered get the ABCs of participating. People who have never paid attention before know that, hey, this information is available to you now. You got to go to these websites. Or maybe you ought to chime in on where vote centers should be or where they shouldn't be. Anything and everything under the sun, but it's part of a healthy democracy and a healthy society.
Great. Well, Senator Padilla and Secretary Padilla, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I also, on behalf of Southern California grant makers, want to thank you for your partnership, for sharing the work that you're doing, for always reaching out and connecting with us, and more importantly, for your expansive view of what civic engagement means and what the role of an office, a constitutional office like the Secretary of State, has in helping us to preserve that and expand it. And around that theme, I would say to you, you mentioned earlier the number of eligible legal permanent residents that there are in the state. As you well know, in Los Angeles County, there's over 755,000, and that are eligible, many of them for more than 10, 15 years they've been eligible. So there's a campaign here in Los Angeles called the Protégete Ciudadanía campaign, Protect Yourself Citizenship Now, that's trying to move these folks, and it has a coalition of a number of organizations, including NALEO. So I would invite you to say, join them, join us in joining Spanish language media, API media, to bring that message and bring your leadership in helping to motivate and educate those legal permanent residents to take that last step and be citizens. So I invite you to join us in that.
I'll be there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.